Hi, I'm glad you are back here again. Please leave a comment down below and tell me what you think of my stories. Let's get straight into it. In August of 1982, the Green River gave up its first secrets. Within days, 5 bodies were pulled from the same stretch of water south of Seattle. Young women, most of them teenagers. And what followed was one of the longest, most costly murder investigations in American history. 49 confirmed victims, likely more who were never found. A killer who lived quietly among his neighbors for over 2 decades. The question that drove investigators mad was never really about who, it was about how. How does a man kill that many people, that many times, and simply walk away? The early 1980s in the Pacific Northwest were not the story of tech booms and coffee culture that came later. This was a region in economic freefall. The timber industry had collapsed. Boeing had shed thousands of jobs. Families were stretched to breaking, and the social net had more holes than it could hold. In Seattle and its surrounding counties, that pressure settled hardest on the people who were already most exposed. Pacific Highway South, which ran through the communities of SeaTac and Des Moines just outside Seattle, was known by a simple name, the Strip. It was a miles-long corridor of motels, truck stops, and parking lots where desperate women worked the street. Many of them were teenagers who had run from home, some from abuse, some from nothing, some from situations that were never documented anywhere. They existed at the edge of the system, and in many cases, they existed completely outside of it. When women disappeared from the Strip, the response was often silence. Families who tried to file missing persons reports were sometimes told their daughters had probably just moved on. Police resources were directed elsewhere. The psychology of the moment is important here, because it shaped everything that came after. These were women the system had already decided not to see, and Ridgway saw that clearly. His target selection was not random. Investigators would later describe it as calculated, even methodical. He chose women who were unlikely to be immediately missed, women whose disappearances could be explained away, women who had few people in a position to push back against institutional indifference. He was not hunting by impulse. He was hunting by design. Through 1981 and into 1982, women began disappearing from the Strip, at a pace that, in hindsight, should have triggered alarm much sooner. But the reports were scattered. Different agencies, different jurisdictions, different case numbers. Nobody was connecting the dots. Some women were not reported missing at all. Others were listed as runaways. The system processed them as individual files, not as a pattern. That is the environment Ridgway moved through, not a shadowy wilderness, not a world apart. He drove the same highway those women stood on. He worked nearby, at a trucking company called Kenworth, painting trucks on an assembly line. He attended church. He had neighbors who waved to him in the morning. The Strip was only a few miles from where he lived, where he worked, where he worshipped. And every time he drove that road, he was, in a sense, hunting, quietly, patiently, without urgency, because he had already figured out that nobody was going to stop him. Not yet. Then the river changed that, not by delivering justice, but by delivering evidence that could no longer be ignored. On August 15th of 1982, a young man wading in the Green River near the town of Auburn made a discovery that would consume the next 2 decades of law enforcement in King County. The body of Wendy Lee Cauffield was pulled from the water. She was 16 years old. She had been reported missing weeks earlier. Nobody had found her until the river gave her up. What came next happened fast, and it was devastating in its clarity. Within days, 4 more bodies were recovered from the same short stretch of the Green River. Deborah Lynn Bonner, Marsha Faye Chapman, Cynthia Jean Hines, Opal Charmaine Mills, all of them young, all of them connected to the Strip. All of them dead. 5 bodies in the same river within days of each other. That was not coincidence. That was a statement, and King County law enforcement now had no choice but to respond. The King County Sheriff's Department formed what would become the Green River Task Force. but in those early weeks, the response was stretched thin before it even started. Resources were limited. The department was not built for a case of this scale. Detectives were pulled from other assignments and handed a crime scene that covered miles of riverbank, with victims who had no clear last known location, no witnesses, and very little physical evidence that the water hadn't already washed away. One of the detectives first on scene for several of those early recoveries was a young investigator named Dave Reichert. He was ambitious and serious, and by his own account, deeply shaken by what he saw on that riverbank. He would become one of the central figures in the investigation, a man whose professional life and personal sense of purpose became inseparable from the case. But in those first weeks, he was simply a detective staring at an impossible problem, because the bodies did not stop. Through the remainder of 1982 and into 1983, remains continued to surface. Some in the river, some in the woods east of the airport, some in clusters, as if they had been placed deliberately, almost systematically. The task force catalogued each one and tried to trace threads back to the living, to witnesses, to last sightings, to anything. What they had forensically was almost nothing useful. This was 1982. DNA analysis as an investigative tool did not exist yet. Trace evidence could be collected, but processing it was slow, expensive, and often inconclusive. The river had done significant damage to whatever the bodies might have told them, and the dump sites in the woods, while better preserved, yielded only fragments of a picture they could not yet assemble. Investigators started to see a pattern in the victim profile, the locations, the manner of death, but the pattern raised more questions than it answered. The killer knew the area. The killer knew these women, or at least how to reach them. The killer was organized enough to move bodies, to use multiple sites, to avoid leaving the kind of obvious evidence that breaks cases open quickly. What they were dealing with was not someone acting in a frenzy. This was deliberate, controlled. Someone who had thought about what he was doing and how to keep doing it. And he was still out there, watching the news, driving the same roads, going to work in the morning, while the task force worked through the night, trying to find a trail that had already gone cold. By 1984, the Green River Task Force was operating under a weight it was never designed to carry. More than 20 women were confirmed dead or missing, and the number kept climbing. The task force had grown, but growth alone does not solve a case when the evidence is thin and the leads run in circles. Investigators were working through thousands of tips, conducting hundreds of interviews, and still coming back to the same place. Nowhere. The forensic limitations of the era were not a small obstacle. They were a wall. There was no DNA technology available for investigative use. Trace evidence, fibers, hair samples, paint transfers could be collected and catalogued, but processing them took time, and without a suspect to match them against, they sat in evidence bags doing nothing. The task force was building a profile of a killer they could not yet name, using tools that were not yet equal to the task. And then there was Gary Ridgway. He surfaced as a suspect in 1983, not through any dramatic break in the case, but through the kind of routine canvassing that generates long lists of names. He was known to patrol the Strip. A previous contact with a sex worker had put him in police records. Investigators brought him in, interviewed him, and administered a polygraph. He passed. And so his name moved down the list, not off it entirely, but far enough down that it stopped being a priority. That detail would prove crucial later. But at the time, the task force had too many names and too few answers to linger on any single one of them. What happened next was unusual. Ted Bundy, already convicted and sitting on death row in Florida, reached out and offered to help profile the Green River killer. Investigators, out of options, took the meeting. What Bundy offered was the perspective of someone who understood, from the inside, how a certain kind of killer thinks. And one of the things he said was this: the killer was almost certainly returning to the bodies. Not to destroy evidence, but for other reasons, psychological reasons, tied to control and possession. Investigators had considered this possibility, but Bundy's insistence sharpened it. The task force set up surveillance at known dump sites, hoping to catch someone revisiting the locations. They waited. Ridgway, for his part, had already moved on. Whether by instinct or by luck, he had stopped returning to the sites that were now being watched. The surveillance yielded nothing. Public pressure during this period was intense and growing. The families of victims who had answers from no one were speaking out, giving interviews demanding accountability. The case had become a source of institutional shame. Millions of dollars had been spent. Dozens of investigators had dedicated years of their lives to it. And the killer was still free. There were arrests during this period, men who fit parts of the profile, men who had connections to the victims or the locations. Each one drew attention, generated press, and ultimately led nowhere. The case consumed them and then released them, and the task force was back at the beginning again. By the late 1980s, something changed. Not the investigation, but the killings. Or at least, the killings they could detect. The disappearances from the strip slowed. The body recoveries slowed. Whether Ridgway had stopped, moved his activity elsewhere, or simply gotten better at concealment, nobody knew. What the task force could see was absence, and absence is almost impossible to investigate. The trail did not just go cold, it went silent. Resources were quietly pulled. Investigators were reassigned. The Green River Task Force did not close, exactly, but it contracted, and the case moved from active emergency to long-term unsolved, which in practical terms meant it moved to the back of the room. New murders came in. New crises demanded attention. The Green River case became something investigators returned to in quiet moments, late at night, when they still believed an answer was out there somewhere. Dave Reichert never stopped believing that. He would carry it into the next decade, and the one after that. The task force that had once employed dozens of detectives shrank to a skeleton. By the early 1990s, the Green River case was being maintained by a handful of people, not solved, just maintained. Files were kept, tips were still logged, but the urgency that had defined the early years had drained away, replaced by something heavier and harder to name. It was the particular exhaustion of a case that gives you nothing back. New homicides kept coming into King County, as they always do. Resources followed the fresh cases, the ones with witnesses still alive, with evidence still warm, with a realistic chance of resolution. The Green River victims did not disappear from the files, but they stopped driving the room. The women who had died on the strip and in the woods around the airport became cold case names on paper, visited occasionally, never forgotten entirely, but no longer the center of anything. For the families, there was no such adjustment. Some had been waiting for answers since 1982. They had buried what they could bury, or in some cases had nothing to bury at all. They lived in the particular limbo of unresolved loss, where grief cannot finish because the story has not ended. Some families stopped pushing. The weight became too much. Others never stopped, writing letters, making calls, showing up at press conferences to put names and faces to the case whenever a camera was there. They kept the victims human in a way the system had failed to. And through all of it, Gary Ridgway went to work. Every morning, he drove to the Kenworth truck factory in Renton and painted trucks on an assembly line. He was, by all accounts, a reliable employee, steady, unremarkable. He remarried in 1988, and then again in 1981, before marrying a third time in 1988. He mowed his lawn. He went to church. Neighbors described him the way neighbors always describe people like him after the fact. Quiet, kept to himself, normal. The psychology of this period is worth sitting with. Ridgway was not in hiding. He was not living under a false identity somewhere remote. He was exactly where he had always been, a few miles from the strip, a few miles from where the bodies had been found, living the kind of ordinary life that the investigation had never quite managed to penetrate. He had been interviewed in 1983 and cleared. He had watched the task force circle around him and move on. And he had drawn from that, apparently, a kind of confidence. The system had looked at him and seen nothing. Whether the killings truly stopped in the late 1980s or simply became harder to detect is a question that was never fully resolved. Ridgway later gave investigators answers that raised more questions than they closed. What is known is that the visible pattern, the body clusters, the recoveries, faded. And without bodies, there is no investigation. There is only waiting. Dave Reichert had become sheriff by this point, having climbed through the ranks of King County law enforcement over the years the case had consumed. He kept the file on his desk. He gave interviews when asked. He made sure the case retained at least some institutional presence, some small claim on resources and attention. He had made a kind of private promise to the victims, and he was not ready to close the account. He would not have to wait much longer. In 2001, the technology finally caught up to what investigators had long suspected but could never prove. Advances in DNA analysis through the 1990s had transformed forensic science in ways that were unimaginable when the Green River case first opened. What had once required large samples and yielded uncertain results could now be done with trace amounts of biological material that had been sitting in evidence storage for over a decade, waiting for science to become equal to the task. Cold case investigators in King County knew they had evidence from the original crime scenes. The question was whether any of it had survived storage well enough to produce a usable profile. It had. Trace evidence collected from 3 victims back in 1987 was pulled from storage and submitted for DNA analysis. The results came back, and they pointed to a single source, Gary Ridgway. The man who had been interviewed in 1983, who had passed a polygraph, who had been on the list and then slowly slid off it, was now sitting at the center of a match that left no room for interpretation. The DNA did not suggest him. It confirmed him. On November 30th of 2001, nearly 2 decades after his name first appeared in the investigation, Gary Ridgway was arrested in the parking lot of the Kenworth plant where he had worked for years. He was taken into custody without incident. He did not run. He did not resist. By most accounts, he was calm. Unsettlingly calm. What followed in the interrogation rooms was, in its own way, as disturbing as anything the investigation had produced. Ridgway was cooperative. He spoke about the murders the way a person might describe a work process, with a kind of flat, technical clarity that investigators described as deeply unnerving. He was not confused. He was not falling apart. He had answers, detailed answers, and he gave them without apparent difficulty. The psychology of the moment is important here, because it revealed something about how he had carried this for 20 years. He had organized it, compartmentalized it, filed it away somewhere that did not touch the rest of his life. Prosecutors faced a decision that was, in its own way, brutal. Ridgway was facing the death penalty, but there were still women unaccounted for, remains that had never been found, families that had been waiting for over 2 decades, with nothing to bury and no answers to hold. The deal they reached was this. Ridgway would cooperate fully, lead investigators to remains they had never located, provide details that only the killer could know, and, in exchange, he would receive life in prison without the possibility of parole. The death penalty would be taken off the table. Not everyone agreed with that trade. Some families did not. Some investigators did not. But the alternative was a trial that might produce a conviction and a sentence without answers, leaving the unresolved cases exactly where they were. Ridgway held up his end in ways that were, by turns, valuable and horrifying. He led investigators to burial sites in areas that had never been searched. He described victims, locations, and methods with a precision that confirmed details from physical evidence. He filled in gaps that had been open for 2 decades. And he did it all with the same flat affect, the same absence of visible remorse, the same clinical tone. He treated the murders like a logistical problem he had solved, and he walked investigators back through his solutions as if reviewing old work. There were moments during the debriefings when investigators had to step out of the room, not because Ridgway was violent or agitated, but because of the opposite, because the absence of anything recognizably human in the way he spoke about what he had done was its own kind of unbearable. He was not a monster in the way people imagine monsters. He was ordinary, and that was so much worse. The case that had consumed King County law enforcement for 20 years was now, finally, moving toward its last chapter. But closure, it turned out, was a complicated thing to find. On November 5th of 2003, Gary Ridgway stood in a King County courtroom and pleaded guilty to 48 counts of murder. A 49th count was added later. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 48 consecutive life sentences, plus additional time. The paperwork alone was staggering. The weight of it, almost impossible to hold. But numbers do not capture what happened in that courtroom. What happened was the families. One by one, the people who had spent years, in some cases over 2 decades, waiting for a moment of reckoning, stood up and faced the man who had taken everything from them. They spoke about their daughters, their sisters, their mothers. They described what it had been like to wait without answers, to bury an empty grief because there was sometimes nothing left to bury, to watch the years pass while the case faded from the news and the world moved on and they could not. Some spoke with fury, some with sorrow so heavy it barely had a voice. Some addressed Ridgway directly, looking at him, demanding that he look back. Ridgway read a statement. It was flat. It was detached. He expressed something that was framed as remorse, but carried none of the feeling the word is supposed to hold. The contrast in that room, between the grief of the families and the blankness of the man who had caused it, was one of the most chilling things anyone who was present that day described afterward. The absence of feeling where feeling should have been. There are broader questions the case forced into the open, questions that did not go away with the sentencing. Why had it taken so long? Why had these particular women been so invisible to the systems that should have protected them? The answer is not simple, but it is not hidden either. The victims were poor, many of them. Many were sex workers. Some were runaways. They occupied the edges of a world that had already decided they were not worth full attention. Law enforcement in the early years of the investigation was working within a culture that reflected those same assumptions. Resources followed priorities, and these women were not a priority. The Green River case changed some of that, not completely and not immediately. But the investigation became a reference point in discussions about how law enforcement categorizes victims, about which disappearances trigger task forces and which ones trigger file numbers. It influenced cold case protocol in departments across the country. It became part of the argument for investing in forensic technology and evidence preservation, even when a case appears to have no near-term solution. The DNA match that caught Ridgway was only possible because someone, years earlier, had preserved that evidence carefully enough for future science to use. Dave Reichert had given 2 decades of his professional life to this case. He had been a young detective on that riverbank in August of 1982, and he had carried it through his career in law enforcement, into the sheriff's office, and eventually into politics. He described the resolution of the case not as triumph, but as something closer to relief, mixed with grief for the years it had taken, and the answers that still remained incomplete. There were victims who were never identified. There were remains that were never found. Ridgway himself acknowledged that his memory was imperfect, and investigators could never be fully certain they had reached every corner of what he had done. Some families never got the specific answers they were looking for. 49 confirmed. Likely more. The ordinary man who drove past the strip every day, who painted trucks and mowed his lawn and sat in church on Sundays, had hidden the largest body count of any convicted serial killer in American history inside a completely unremarkable life. And that is the part that stays with you. Not the monster you expected, the neighbor you never suspected. 49 confirmed victims, and the real number is almost certainly higher. The Green River case reshaped how investigators handle cold evidence, marginalized victims, and the long patience required to close what time leaves open. The most unsettling thing Ridgway ever revealed was not a location or a detail. It was how easily ordinary life conceals the worst things people do. Let's get to the second story. November 15th, 1959. Holcomb, Kansas. A farming town so quiet that people left their doors unlocked at night, because nothing bad ever happened there. Then one morning, a 16-year-old girl didn't show up where she was expected. A friend went to check on her. What she found inside that house would change the town forever, and a few years later, it would change American culture in ways nobody could have predicted. 4 people, 1 night, no witnesses, and the men responsible were already hundreds of miles away. To understand what was lost on that November night, you have to understand who the Clutters were and what they meant to the people around them. Herb Clutter was not a man who was handed anything. He built River Valley Farm through discipline and genuine hard work, and by the late 1950s, he was running one of the most respected operations in Finney County, Kansas. He grew wheat and sorghum, raised cattle, employed local men, and paid them fairly. People in Holcomb knew Herb as the kind of man who kept his word. If he shook your hand on a deal, the deal was done. He didn't drink. He didn't carry debt. He was active in his church and known across the county as someone who would help a neighbor without being asked. His wife, Bonnie, was a quieter presence. She had struggled with depression and anxiety for years, a weight she carried mostly in private. She rarely left the house. The illness had pulled her back from the rhythms of daily life in ways that were difficult for her family to navigate, but the Clutters managed it together. Herb was steady. The children learned to be steady too. Nancy was 16. She was the kind of teenager that other parents pointed to, not out of comparison, but out of genuine admiration. She was active in her church group, popular at school, and generous with her time. She taught younger kids in the area how to bake. She gave riding lessons on her horse, Babe. Her friends described her as warm and reliable, someone who showed up. Kenyon was 15. Where Nancy was outward, Kenyon was inward. He spent a lot of time in his workshop, taking things apart and putting them back together. He was building a hope chest for his older sister's upcoming marriage at the time of his death. He was quiet in the way that certain kids are quiet, not withdrawn, just thoughtful. The Clutter family was, by every account, exactly what they appeared to be. Financially stable, church-going, generous, no enemies anyone knew of, no disputes, no hidden fractures that investigators would later uncover. The family existed inside a life that was ordered and decent, and they had no reason to believe that the world outside Holcomb held anything that could reach them. That contrast between the stillness of that life and the violence that ended it is part of what made this case so difficult for people to process. It wasn't just a crime, it was an erasure. While the Clutters were living that quiet life in western Kansas, 2 men were making a series of decisions that would eventually bring them to Holcomb. Richard Hickok and Perry Smith had both served time at Kansas State Penitentiary. They met there and formed the kind of bond that sometimes develops between men in that environment, built on proximity, shared frustration, and a mutual sense that the world outside owed them something. Hickok was impulsive and talkative, the kind of man who talked big and moved fast. He had a history of bad checks, petty theft, the pattern of someone always chasing a shortcut. Smith was different, quieter on the surface, but with a violence underneath that was harder to predict. He had a difficult childhood, marked by instability and abuse, had moved through foster care and institutions, and carried a deep resentment that he rarely expressed directly. The 2 men made an unstable pair, but in the months leading up to November 1959, they had a plan, and the plan came from a 3rd man. Floyd Wells had shared a cell with Hickok at the penitentiary. Years before his arrest, Wells had worked on the Clutter farm as a hired hand. At some point during their time together, Wells mentioned Herb Clutter to Hickok. The detail that stuck was this. Wells believed Herb kept a large amount of cash in a safe somewhere in his home. That detail was almost certainly wrong. Herb Clutter was known to conduct almost all of his business by check. There was no safe full of cash. But Hickok didn't know that, and once the idea was in his head, it didn't leave. Hickok began planning what he called a perfect crime. He and Smith would drive to Holcomb, find the safe, take the cash, and leave no witnesses. That last part, leaving no witnesses, was the part that made the plan something different from a robbery. It was a death sentence for a family that had never met either man and had done nothing to deserve what was coming. They drove from Las Vegas toward Kansas on the night of November 14th, 1959. They had rope, tape, and a shotgun. They had a map. They had the name of a man they had never spoken to and an address in a town most people had never heard of. What they didn't have was the cash. Because it was never there to begin with. They arrived in Holcomb sometime after midnight. The farmhouse was dark. The family was asleep. Hickok and Smith cut the phone lines, then entered the home. What happened over the next several hours was pieced together later through Smith's confession, physical evidence, and the careful reconstruction work of investigators who spent weeks inside that house trying to understand the sequence of events. There was no safe. They searched, and they found nothing close to what Wells had described. The total cash in the house amounted to less than $50. A pair of binoculars, a small radio. That was it. The entire premise of the plan, the thing that had driven these two men across hundreds of miles of highway, was built on a story that was never true. What happened next came down to a decision. Hickok had said from the beginning that there would be no witnesses. Smith would later describe a moment of hesitation, a pause in the basement, where the reality of what they were about to do briefly surfaced. But the decision had already been made, days or weeks before they ever pulled into Finney County. The family's fate had been settled in a prison cell by a man repeating a story he half remembered about a safe that didn't exist. Herb Clutter was in the basement. He had been calm throughout, cooperative, trying to reason with the men who had come into his home. That composure, that steadiness that everyone in Holcomb knew him for, held even then. He was bound. His throat was cut. Then he was shot at close range with the shotgun. The rest of the family had been separated, moved to different rooms, bound and left to wait in the dark while the men moved through the house. Kenyon was in his room. Bonnie was in hers. Nancy was in her own room down the hall. Each of them was killed in turn. The psychology of the moment is important. This was not a rage killing. There was no escalating argument, no explosion of violence born from panic or confrontation. It was methodical. The family members were killed one by one, in sequence, by men who had made the decision before they ever walked through the door. The word that investigators would return to again and again in the weeks that followed was calculated, not frenzied, not chaotic. Calculated. Hickok and Smith left the house in the early hours of the morning. They drove away from Holcomb with under $50, a pair of binoculars, and a radio. The farmhouse sat quiet. The phone lines were cut. There was no one to call out to, and no one nearby to hear anything. In the hours before dawn, 4 members of one family lay dead in different rooms of their own home. The wheat fields outside were still. The town around them was asleep. By the time the sun came up over western Kansas, Hickok and Smith were already gone, moving east, putting distance between themselves and what they had done. They had no way of knowing that the case would follow them for the rest of their lives. They had no way of knowing that a single phone call, made weeks later from inside a prison, would unravel everything. But that was still ahead. For now, the house was quiet, and Holcomb had not yet woken up to what the night had left behind. Sunday morning, November 15th, 1959. Nancy Clutter was supposed to meet her friend Susan Kidwell for church. Nancy was reliable. That was one of the things everyone said about her. She showed up. So when she didn't, Susan went to the farm to find her. She found the front door unlocked. She called out. No one answered. She moved through the house and found Nancy in her room, and that was where the morning stopped making sense entirely. Susan ran. Neighbors called the sheriff's office. And within hours, Holcomb had crossed into a version of itself it would never fully leave. Investigators arrived to find a scene that was methodical in ways that made it harder to absorb, not easier. There was no chaos, no sign of a frantic struggle, no furniture overturned in the way you might expect from a violent home invasion. The house was quiet and largely intact, which made what was inside it feel even more wrong. Herb Clutter was found in the basement. He had been bound, his throat had been cut, and he had been shot at close range. The other 3 members of the family were found in separate rooms throughout the house, each bound, each killed in the same deliberate way. The shotgun had been the final method in each case. Kansas Bureau of Investigation agent Alvin Dewey took the lead on the investigation. Dewey was experienced and methodical, the right kind of temperament for a case that gave investigators almost nothing to work with in those first days. There was no forced entry. The family had not struggled in any visible way that suggested they had fought back or tried to run. There were no clear signs of who had been in the house or why. The phone lines had been cut, which told investigators the visitors had come with a plan. But the plan's origin and the identities of the men behind it were completely unknown. The motive was the most unsettling gap of all. The Clutters had no enemies. Nobody in Holcomb could point to a dispute, a grudge, a business conflict, or any person in the family's life who might have wanted them dead. In most homicide cases, investigators start with people who knew the victim. Here, that starting point led nowhere. Everyone who knew the Clutters described the same thing: a decent, quiet family, with no reason to be afraid of anyone. The town felt that absence of explanation as something physical. Holcomb was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, where doors stayed unlocked because there was no reason to lock them. Within days of the murders, that changed. People were locking their doors. They were watching the road. The familiar rhythms of small-town life had been interrupted by something that didn't fit the world they thought they lived in. If the killer or killers had known the family, there would have been some thread to pull. But the house offered no thread. No motive, no suspects, no witnesses, no trail. Just 4 people who had been alive on Friday and were gone by Sunday morning, and a town trying to understand how that was possible. The news spread fast. By the time the following week's papers had cycled through, the Clutter murders were not just a local story. They were national. A family of 4, killed in their home in a small Kansas farming town. No suspects, no motive, no explanation. The details that made the case so unsettling were the same details that made it impossible to ignore. Alvin Dewey and his team worked through hundreds of interviews in the weeks that followed. They talked to neighbors, to farmhands, to business contacts of Herb's, to people who had attended the same church, to anyone who had any connection to the family or to River Valley Farm. The picture that kept emerging was the same one investigators had started with. The Clutters were well-liked and clean. There was nothing there. The community of Holcomb held on to the belief, almost as a matter of psychological necessity, that whoever had done this must have known the family. It was easier to live with the idea of a known enemy than with the alternative. The alternative was that strangers had simply chosen them, driven to their door from somewhere far away, and killed them for reasons that had nothing to do with who they were as people. That possibility was harder to sit with. Meanwhile, Hickok and Smith were moving. After leaving Holcomb, they drifted through Kansas City, then south toward Texas, then into Mexico for a stretch, then back north through Florida. They were writing bad checks along the way, the same petty pattern Hickok had always fallen back on, funding their movement with fraud, while the investigation into the biggest case of their lives was building behind them. They had no reason to believe they were connected to it. They had left no obvious trail at the farm. As far as they knew, the safe story had died with the family. But there was one problem. and the problem had a name. Floyd Wells was still in prison. He had heard about the Clutter murders on the radio sometime in the weeks after November 15th, 1959, and the details he heard matched the conversation he remembered having with Hickok in their shared cell. A wealthy farmer, a safe western Kansas. He sat with that knowledge for a while. Maybe he weighed what coming forward would cost him and what staying silent would cost him too. Eventually he decided to talk. Wells contacted investigators and told them about the conversation with Hickok. He described what he had said about Herb Clutter, the farm, and the supposed safe. He told them Hickok had fixated on it. He told them about Perry Smith. It was the thread investigators had been looking for since the morning Susan Kidwell walked into that farmhouse. 6 weeks of silence, 6 weeks of interviews that led nowhere, and then a single conversation from inside a prison cell broke the case open entirely. With Hickok and Smith named as suspects, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation and the FBI moved quickly. Both men were tracked to Las Vegas, Nevada, and arrested on December 30th, 1959. 45 days had passed since the murders. The men who had driven across Kansas with a shotgun and a rope were picked up on a street in Nevada, still running bad checks, still drifting, apparently without any real plan for where they were going. They were questioned separately. That was deliberate. Investigators wanted to see where the stories diverged, and they diverged quickly. Hickok tried to construct a version of events that put distance between himself and the killings. He admitted to being at the farm, but worked to minimize his direct role in what had happened inside the house. His account shifted and softened in places that would have mattered most in court. Smith's account was different. At some point during the interrogation, he gave investigators a detailed confession. He described the layout of the house. He described the sequence of events, which family member was moved where, who was killed first, how it was done. He described the drive to Holcomb and the drive away from it. The level of detail was precise enough that it could only have come from someone who had been inside that house. The confession confirmed what investigators had feared from the beginning. The family had been killed to eliminate witnesses to a robbery that had produced almost nothing. Less than $50, a pair of binoculars, a small radio. 4 lives taken in sequence in exchange for that. There was no safe. There had never been a safe. The entire chain of events, from Floyd Wells telling a story in a prison cell to 2 men standing over Herb Clutter in a basement in Kansas, had been set in motion by a detail that was never even true. Both men were extradited back to Kansas to face trial. The legal process was just beginning, but the core of the case was already settled. They had been at the farm. Smith had said so himself, in detail, in a way that couldn't be walked back. Hickok's attempt to separate himself from the killings had not held up against what Smith described. The people of Holcomb had been waiting 6 weeks for an answer. They had one now. But the answer, when it came, did not bring much comfort. The men who killed the Clutters were strangers. They had driven to that farmhouse because of a rumor. They had never met the family they killed. And they had left with almost nothing. The trial began in March 1960 in Garden City, Kansas, about 30 miles from Holcomb. The courthouse was full. People had driven in from surrounding towns. The case had been national news for months, and now it was playing out in a courtroom in the middle of the plains, with the men who had done it sitting at the defense table. Defense attorneys made an early push for a change of venue. Their argument was reasonable enough that the saturation of local coverage had made a fair trial in Finney County impossible. Every person in that part of Kansas knew the Clutter name. Every potential juror had been living inside the shadow of this case since November. The request was denied. The trial stayed in Garden City. The defense also attempted to introduce testimony around the mental state of both defendants. There were genuine questions, particularly around Perry Smith, about psychological history, trauma, and the kind of damage that accumulates in a person across years of institutional neglect and abuse. Whether those questions deserved more weight than the court gave them became a point of debate that would outlast the trial itself. At the time, Under Kansas law, the standard for legal insanity was narrow, and neither man met it, as the court defined the threshold. The jury was not asked to weigh the complexity of how either man had arrived at that farmhouse. They were asked to decide what happened there. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Both men were convicted on all 4 counts of murder. The sentence was death by hanging. What followed was 5 years of legal process. Appeals were filed and argued, delayed and revisited. The case moved through the courts slowly, the way capital cases tend to, with each appeal extending the timeline and pushing the execution date further out. Hickok and Smith sat in the Kansas State Penitentiary at Lansing, waiting. During those 5 years, a writer named Truman Capote was making regular visits to Kansas. He had traveled there shortly after the arrests with his childhood friend Harper Lee, drawn by the story, and had spent years conducting interviews, attending court proceedings, and building a detailed account of everything from the Clutter family's last days to the psychology of the men who killed them. He spoke to Alvin Dewey. He spoke to people in Holcomb. And he spent considerable time with both Hickok and Smith, developing a relationship with Smith in particular that became, by most accounts, genuinely complicated. Capote was writing what he called a non-fiction novel. The book would not be finished until after the executions. Hickok and Smith were hanged on April 14, 1965. The executions took place at the Kansas State Penitentiary, just after midnight. Alvin Dewey was present. Capote was present. The 5-year legal process ended in a matter of minutes, in the dark, in a prison warehouse. The legal chapter of the Clutter case was closed. But the story itself was far from over, because Truman Capote was still writing. And what he published the following year would pull the case back into the center of American culture in ways that nobody in Holcomb had anticipated. Truman Capote published In Cold Blood in 1966. It had taken him 6 years to write it, and by the time it appeared in print, first as a serialized piece in The New Yorker and then as a full book, it landed with a weight that most published work never achieves. It was not just a successful book. It was a rupture in how Americans thought about true crime, about journalism, and about the people capable of committing acts like the ones that happened in Holcomb. Capote had done something that nobody had quite done before, at least not at that scale. He had reconstructed the entire arc of the case, from the Clutter family's last ordinary days to the execution of the men who killed them, using the tools of fiction writing applied to documented fact. The scenes had texture. The dialogue had rhythm. The people inside the story were rendered as full human beings rather than names in a police report. Readers who had never been to Kansas and had no connection to the Clutter family found themselves inside that farmhouse, inside that investigation, inside the minds of the men on death row. The book made people uncomfortable in specific ways. It asked readers to hold 2 things at once: the reality of what Hickok and Smith had done, and the reality of how they had come to be the kind of men who could do it. Perry Smith's history was detailed throughout the book: the instability of his childhood, the abuse, the string of institutions that had cycled him through without ever addressing what was actually wrong. Capote was not arguing that Smith's history excused the murders, but he was making it impossible to look away from that history, and that made some readers angry, and made others reconsider what they thought they knew about punishment, guilt, and the systems that shape people before they ever commit a crime. The question of capital punishment ran underneath the whole book. Kansas had hanged 2 men for the Clutter murders. Capote had watched it happen. In Cold Blood did not answer the question of whether that was right or wrong, but it asked the question clearly enough that readers had to form their own position. The debate around that question, in the mid-1960s, was not a quiet one. Holcomb itself was changed in ways that the book captured and, in some ways, extended. The sense of safety that had defined that community before November 15, 1959, did not come back after the arrests, or after the trial, or after the executions. It was gone. and the publication of a best-selling book that put Holcomb at the center of a national conversation did not help the town return to anonymity. People came to see the farm. They drove past the house. The place that had been known for wheat and quiet and decent people was now known for something else entirely. Alvin Dewey, the KBI agent who had led the investigation, stayed in contact with Capote for years. He later said that the case never fully left him. He had seen what was inside that farmhouse. No amount of time and no amount of legal resolution could undo that. So what do you do with a case like this once you know all of it? The Clutter murders are sometimes described as random, and in a narrow sense that's true. Hickok and Smith did not know the family. They had no personal grievance against Herb Clutter, no history with Bonnie or Nancy or Kenyon. They chose that farmhouse because of a story a man told in a prison cell, a story that turned out to be wrong in its most important detail. In that sense, the Clutters were not targeted for who they were. They were targeted for where they lived and what someone believed, incorrectly, was inside their home. But random is too simple a word for what actually happened. Because the chain of decisions that led to that farmhouse was long and specific. Wells told a story. Hickok fixated on it. The two men made a plan that included, from the beginning, the killing of anyone who could identify them. That wasn't an improvised decision made in the chaos of a robbery gone wrong. It was built into the plan before they ever left Las Vegas. The erasure of the Clutter family was premeditated in a way that investigators and later the court found unambiguous. What nobody could fully absorb, then or now, was the arithmetic of it. 4 lives, taken in sequence, with deliberate method, in exchange for less than $50 and a pair of binoculars. The gap between the cost and what was gained is so extreme that it resists ordinary logic. And that gap is part of what made the case so hard for people to process. In 1959, and part of what still makes it hard now, Perry Smith's psychology has been studied and written about more than almost any other figure in American true crime history, largely because of how Capote rendered him in the book. The picture that emerged was of a man shaped by conditions that had failed him at almost every turn. An unstable childhood, abuse that went unaddressed, institutions that cycled him through without treatment, without stability, without any consistent structure that might have redirected what was building inside him. That context matters, not because it changes what he did, it doesn't, but because it complicates the version of the story where the explanation is simply that some people are born to do terrible things and that's the end of it. Hickok is the harder figure to frame that way. His background was more stable, his path to violence less clearly determined by systemic failure. The contrast between the two men and what each of them represented about the roads that lead to that kind of act is something criminologists and psychologists return to for decades after the case closed. The broader thing the Clutter murders forced onto the American consciousness was a confrontation with a specific kind of fear. Not the fear of someone you know turning on you, not the fear of a place or a situation you can identify and avoid. The fear of strangers, arriving without warning, from nowhere in particular, with no personal connection to you, and no reason beyond a chain of bad decisions that you had no part in and no way to foresee. That fear, once it exists, doesn't go away easily. Holcomb felt it first, in the days after November 15th, 1959. But the publication of In Cold Blood spread it further, into living rooms and bedrooms across the country, into the minds of people who had never been to Kansas and never would be. The Clutter farm still stands outside Holcomb. The house is still there. People still drive past it. The town has moved forward in the way that towns do, because life continues and communities find ways to carry what happened to them. But Holcomb before that night and Holcomb after it are 2 different places, and everyone who was there for both versions knows the difference. 4 people, 1 night. A ripple that moved through American culture for decades and has not fully stopped moving. What happened in that farmhouse is one of the most studied crimes in American history, and it still doesn't fully make sense, which may be the most honest thing you can say about it. Let's get to the third story. In 1973, a man called the Santa Cruz Police Department from a phone booth in Pueblo, Colorado. He told the officer on the line that he had killed 8 people. The officer told him to call back when a senior detective was available. He called back, more than once. He had to convince them he was telling the truth. That man was Edmund Kemper, 6 feet 9 inches tall. An IQ of 145. And by the time anyone believed him, he had already done everything he was confessing to. How does someone this intelligent, this self-aware, arrive at that phone booth? That is what we are going to work through tonight. Edmund Emil Kemper was born on the 18th of December, 1948, in Burbank, California. On paper, he came from an ordinary American family: a father, a mother, 2 sisters, a house, a yard. But ordinary is rarely what it looks like from the outside. His father, Edmund Kemper Jr., was described by those who knew him as emotionally distant. He worked in nuclear testing, spent long periods away from home, and when Edmund was 9 years old, he left the family entirely. That absence would leave a gap in the boy that nothing else ever filled. What remained was his mother, Clarnell Strandberg, and the relationship between them is the center of gravity for everything that follows in this story. People who knew Clarnell described her as domineering and deeply critical, someone who could cut with a word and often did. She directed a significant portion of that criticism toward her son. Edmund was large for his age, quiet, and socially awkward, and Clarnell seemed to find those qualities embarrassing. She mocked him. She compared him unfavorably to other children. She told him he would never amount to anything. But here is where it becomes something harder to understand. At some point, Clarnell began to lock Edmund in the basement at night. She told his sisters she was afraid of what he might do to them. Edmund had not done anything. He was a child. But the message that was sent to him, in that house, in that basement, was that he was something to be feared, something to be contained, before he had given anyone a reason to think so. The psychology of the moment is important. When a child is treated as dangerous before they have been dangerous, something in their understanding of themselves begins to shift. He was not being punished for behavior. He was being punished for what his mother imagined he might be. Edmund began to pull inward. He played a game with his sister called Gas Chamber, where she would blindfold him, lead him to a chair, and he would act out his own execution. It was unusual and unsettling, even by the standards of dark childhood play. He was rehearsing death, his own, in that game. But the rehearsal revealed a mind that was already circling something most children never think about at all. There were other signs. He decapitated a cat he had kept as a pet, buried it, and then later dug it up. These were not the actions of a child who was simply troubled. Investigators and psychologists who later reviewed his case described a pattern of dissociation, a mind learning to separate feeling from action. But none of this was addressed. None of it brought help. Instead, Clarnell made a decision that would remove Edmund from the house entirely and place him somewhere that would only deepen everything already building inside him. She sent him to live with his grandparents. Edmund was 15 years old when Clarnell sent him to live with his paternal grandparents, Edmund and Maud Kemper, on a remote mountain ranch in North Fork, California. The property sat in the Sierra Nevada foothills, quiet and isolated, far from anything resembling a social life for a teenage boy who was already struggling to connect with the world around him. His grandfather, also named Edmund, was a writer, and by most accounts, treated the boy with more warmth than he had known at home. That mattered to him. He spoke about it later. But his grandmother Maud was a different story. She was controlling, sharp-tongued, and critical in ways that felt immediately familiar to Edmund. He had left one version of that dynamic in Burbank and found another version waiting for him in the mountains. He described feeling passed around, unwanted, a problem being handed from one set of adults to another, none of whom knew what to do with him. He was large, quiet, and increasingly closed off. And whatever was building inside him, the isolation of North Fork gave it room to grow without interference. On the 27th of August, 1964, Edmund Kemper was 15 years old when he picked up a rifle and shot his grandmother, Maud, in the kitchen of the ranch house. He shot her once, then twice more. He would later tell investigators that he had been arguing with her, that something in him simply broke. But he also said something else, something that stays with you. He said he wanted to know what it felt like. That is not the language of a child acting out of rage. That is curiosity. Cold, deliberate curiosity about an act most people could not bring themselves to imagine. He then sat and waited. His grandfather was out. When the older man's car pulled into the driveway later that afternoon, Edmund went outside and shot him before he could get out of the vehicle. When asked about that second killing, he said he did not want his grandfather to see what he had done to his grandmother inside. There is a pattern already visible here, even at 15. The act, then the management of consequences, the awareness of how things would look, the thinking that came after. He went inside and called his mother. Then he called the police himself. That detail matters. It would happen again, years later, under far heavier circumstances. Edmund Kemper, even as a teenager, did not run. He reported. He stayed. He waited to be found. He was evaluated and committed to a Atascadero State Hospital for the criminally insane. The court determined he could not be tried as an adult given his age, and so the question of what to do with him fell to the mental health system. Doctors at Atascadero found him cooperative, articulate, and highly intelligent. He engaged with staff. He answered questions thoroughly. He was, by all observable measures, a model patient. But the doctors who spent the most time with him were not fully comfortable with what they saw. His intelligence was not in question. His rehabilitation was. That concern would matter later. Or rather, the fact that it was ignored would matter later. For now, Edmund Kemper was a teenager in a hospital, learning the language of the people evaluating him and doing it faster than any of them fully realized. Edmund Kemper spent 5 years at Atascadero State Hospital, from 1964 to 1969. 5 years that should have been the system's best chance to understand what it was dealing with and to make a careful, measured decision about what came next. In many ways, he was the ideal patient. He followed the rules. He engaged with staff. He participated in group sessions and individual evaluations with the kind of thoughtful, composed attention that made clinicians feel their work was landing. He was polite. He was articulate. He did not cause problems. And he was genuinely curious about psychology, about the frameworks clinicians use to understand behavior and motivation. That curiosity turned out to be something the hospital did not fully account for. Over time, Kemper was given increasing responsibility within the facility. He began helping staff administer psychological tests to other patients. He scored high on every evaluation he was given. The language of mental health assessment, the specific questions examiners asked, the kinds of answers that indicated progress and stability, he absorbed all of it. He learned what rehabilitation was supposed to look like, and he reflected it back with precision. He said so himself, years later, in interviews with FBI agents. He understood exactly what the evaluators were looking for. He knew which answers opened doors and which ones kept them closed. By the time his case came up for review, he had spent years studying the very tools being used to measure him. The California Youth Authority recommended his release. He was 21 years old. The recommendation noted his cooperation, his intelligence, and his apparent progress. What it did not fully weigh were the concerns raised by several of the psychiatrists who had worked most closely with him. Those clinicians had reservations. They felt he was not ready. Some believed he should not be returned to his mother's care under any circumstances. That the dynamic between Edmund and Clarnell was itself a risk factor that had never been resolved. Their concerns were set aside. He was released in 1969, at 21, and placed directly into his mother's custody. The very environment that multiple professionals had flagged as harmful. The juvenile records from his case, including the details of what he had done to his grandparents, were sealed when he turned 21, as was standard procedure at the time. That meant anyone who encountered him going forward, employers, law enforcement, anyone who ran a background check, would find nothing. He applied to become a California Highway Patrol officer not long after his release. He wanted to work in law enforcement. The application was rejected, not because of any flag in his record, but simply because he was too tall. The department had a height limit, and at 6 feet 9 inches, he exceeded it. So he was turned away from the one structured, supervised career path he had expressed genuine interest in, and sent back to navigate civilian life with a sealed record, no professional oversight, and Clarnell waiting at home. The system had done everything it was supposed to do, on paper. And in doing so, it had missed almost everything that actually mattered. V. Back under his mother's roof, Edmund Kemper was 21 years old, recently released from a psychiatric facility, and living in Santa Cruz, California, where Clarnell had taken a position as an administrative assistant at the University of California. On the surface, it looked like a second chance. A young man, troubled history behind him, trying to build something resembling a normal life. He worked road construction. He saved money carefully and methodically. He bought a motorcycle, had a serious accident, received a small settlement from it, and used that money to buy a car. He was moving forward, or at least performing the motion of it. But inside that house, nothing had changed. Clarnell was openly contemptuous of her son. She mocked his ambitions. She compared him, often and without much subtlety, to the university students she worked alongside every day, people with degrees and prospects and futures she felt Edmund could never match. The criticism was not occasional. It was the texture of daily life in that house. Edmund was large and quiet and trying, and his mother seemed to find each of those qualities irritating in its own way. He did not leave. That is the part that requires sitting with for a moment. He was an adult. He had a job, a car, some savings. He could have put distance between himself and Clarnell, but he stayed. Psychologists who later reviewed his case pointed to this as significant, the way the relationship between Edmund and his mother had become a kind of gravitational pull he could not break free from, even when he had the means to try. Instead, he found other ways to manage what was building inside him. He had begun cultivating friendships with officers from the California Highway Patrol, the agency that had rejected his application. He spent time at a bar in Santa Cruz called the Jury Room, a place frequented by local law enforcement. He was good company. He knew the language of police work. He asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to the answers. The officers who knew him during this period described him as someone who genuinely admired what they did. Nobody looked twice at him. And then there was the car. He began picking up hitchhikers. At that time, in the early 1970s, hitchhiking was common in and around Santa Cruz, particularly among young women connected to the university. Kemper started giving them rides, driving them safely to wherever they were going, and then sitting alone afterward in what he later described as a kind of relief. He told FBI investigators that he thought of this period as practice. He was testing himself, testing his ability to appear calm and trustworthy, to control an interaction, to feel the tension of the moment and not act on it. Each safe ride felt, to him, like a victory over the impulse. He described it in those terms. Calmly, years later, sitting across from agents Robert Ressler and John Douglas. Practice, control, repetition. The psychology of the moment is important, because what sounds, on the surface, like restraint, was actually something else entirely. He was not learning to stop. He was learning to wait. The practice stopped working in the spring of 1972. Whatever internal mechanism Edmund Kemper had been using to hold himself back, it gave way. And between the 7th of May, 1972, and the 5th of February, 1973, 6 young women were killed, all of them hitchhikers. most of them connected in some way to the University of California, Santa Cruz, the same institution where his mother worked, the same campus whose students she regularly held up as everything her son was not. That detail is not incidental. Investigators and psychologists who later reviewed the case considered it carefully. The victims were not random in the way that word is sometimes used to mean senseless. There was a pattern in who he chose, and where, and when. Whether that pattern was fully conscious or not, it was there. The first were Mary Ann Pesch and Anita Lucchesa, on the 7th of May, 1972. Both were students at Fresno State, hitchhiking toward Stanford University. They accepted a ride from a clean car, driven by a calm, well-spoken man who gave them no reason to feel uneasy. Kemper had spent months refining exactly that impression. He knew how to appear safe. He had practiced it deliberately, on this same stretch of road, with other young women who had arrived home without incident. These two did not. On the 14th of September, 1972, 15-year-old Aiko Koo was trying to get to a dance class in San Francisco. She had missed her bus and decided to hitchhike. She was, by all accounts, a bright and determined young woman, with her whole life still ahead of her. She accepted a ride. Kemper was, again, calm and presentable, and unthreatening in the way he had worked hard to become. Cindy Schall, a student at Cabrillo College, was killed on the 8th of January, 1973. And then, on the 5th of February, 1973, Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu, both students at UC Santa Cruz, were killed. 2 in a single evening. 6 young women across 9 months, each of them simply trying to get somewhere. What is important to understand about the method, without dwelling in the details, is how unremarkable it appeared from the outside. He drove a clean, ordinary car. He was dressed normally. He was articulate and calm, and did nothing to signal danger in the moments before it arrived. The women who got into his car had no framework for what was happening, because he had spent months ensuring there was nothing visible to react to. He later described the entire period to FBI agents Robert Ressler and John Douglas in a level of psychological detail that those investigators said they had, rarely encountered before or since. He could articulate his own mental state, his own reasoning, his own process, in a way that was precise and almost clinical. He was not rationalizing or minimizing. He was explaining, as if he were describing someone else's behavior, something he had studied from a distance rather than lived from the inside. Ressler and Douglas were building what would eventually become the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, and Kemper became one of their most significant interview subjects, precisely because of this. His ability to describe organized, predatory thinking from the inside gave investigators a framework they had not had before. The concept of the organized offender, someone who plans, who controls the environment, who manages risk deliberately, took on much sharper definition after those interviews. But that was later. In the spring and winter of 1972 and 1973, none of that framework existed yet. What existed was a series of missing and deceased young women, a community growing frightened, and a man who drove back to Santa Cruz after each one, parked his car, walked into the jury room, and sat down next to the officers investigating the same cases he had just created. Nobody looked twice. The double life he was living was not accidental. It was, in its own way, the most calculated thing about him. To understand how Edmund Kemper moved through Santa Cruz without drawing suspicion, you have to understand what Santa Cruz looked like in 1972 and 1973. Because he was not the only person killing there. Herbert Mullin was active during the same period, killing 13 people between October of 1972 and February of 1973. John Linley Frazier had killed 5 members of a family in the hills above Santa Cruz in 1970. The city's law enforcement was stretched thin, attention divided across multiple open investigations, and the profile of a dangerous person that investigators were working from was being pulled in several directions at once. Kemper knew this. He followed the news carefully. He understood that the noise of multiple active cases created a kind of cover, that in a situation of that much confusion, a calm and cooperative man with no record was among the last people anyone would be looking at closely. He moved through police checkpoints that had been set up specifically to catch the Santa Cruz killers. He was waved through. Sometimes he chatted briefly with the officers at the roadblock before driving on. He described those moments later with a kind of detached clarity, the way you might describe waiting in a line at a grocery store. There was no anxiety in his recollection, no close call that made his heart race. Just a man at a checkpoint, being waved through because nothing about him looked wrong. That was not luck. It was the result of years of deliberate construction. The friendships he had built with local officers were genuine in the way that mattered most for his purposes. These were not casual acquaintances. He spent real time with them. He knew their names, their cases, their frustrations with the investigation. He listened. He asked follow-up questions. He was the kind of person you looked forward to seeing at the bar because he made you feel heard. Officers who knew him during this period were later asked to describe him, and the words that came up repeatedly were the same ones. Friendly, knowledgeable, calm. Someone who seemed to genuinely care about the work law enforcement did. Nobody flagged anything. Nobody felt uneasy. The officers who investigated the co-ed murders and the man who was committing them were, during this period, sitting in the same room, drinking the same coffee, talking about the same cases. In hindsight, that is one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire story. Not the crimes themselves, but the proximity. The way he maintained that closeness with investigators throughout, not as a reckless gamble, but as something that appears to have been, at least in part, intentional. Being near law enforcement kept him calibrated. It told him what they knew and what they didn't. It reminded him, in a concrete and ongoing way, that they were not looking at him. There is also something else worth sitting with here. Kemper genuinely wanted to be in law enforcement. He had applied. He had been rejected on a technicality of height, nothing more. The career he built for himself in the shadows of that rejection was, in some ways, shaped around it. The jury room was not just cover. It was, for him, the closest available version of something he had actually wanted. The center of everything, though, was still his mother's house. Whatever was happening in Santa Cruz, whatever double life he was maintaining in the bars and on the roads, he came home to Clarnell. And that relationship was the one thing he had never found a way to manage. Easter weekend, 1973. Edmund Kemper had been living in his mother's house for years. He had killed 6 young women. He had sat across from the officers investigating those killings and said nothing. And still, every time he came home, Clarnell was there, with the same contempt, the same comparisons, the same voice that had been cutting into him since he was a child in a basement in Burbank. Whatever had kept that final boundary in place, it gave way in the early hours of Good Friday morning. He entered his mother's bedroom while she slept. He did not wake her. What happened next was quiet, and we will leave the specifics there. What matters for understanding what followed is this. After decades of psychological damage, after years of violence directed at others, the thing that had always sat at the center of his story had finally been reached. Clarnell Strandberg Kemper was gone. He did not leave immediately. He stayed in the house. He thought about what came next, with the same methodical attention he brought to everything else. His mother had a close friend, a woman named Sarah Taylor Hallett. Kemper called her, told her something that would bring her to the house, and waited. When she arrived, he killed her as well. He told investigators later that he had not wanted his mother to be found alone. He also said he had not wanted Sarah to carry the grief of what she would have found if she had simply shown up on her own. Those were the reasons he gave, offered plainly, without visible emotion, as if they were straightforward logistical considerations. That quality, the calm, accounting for consequences, the management of the scene, runs through everything he did. Even here, at the end of it, he was thinking ahead. After that, he got in his car and drove east. he drove for days. Through California, into Colorado, listening to the radio the entire time, waiting for news of what he had left behind to break nationally. He expected it. He assumed that the discovery of his mother's house, combined with the ongoing investigation into the co-ed murders, would produce some kind of immediate and widespread response. His name connected to everything. It did not happen. The story did not break the way he anticipated, and that, in its own strange way, seemed to unsettle him more than anything else. He had called the Santa Cruz Police Department before, from the road. Not to confess, but to stay connected, to keep a hand on the temperature of the investigation. He knew those officers. He had spent years building that familiarity. But now, he was calling for a different reason. From a phone booth in Pueblo, Colorado, he called the Santa Cruz Police Department and told the officer who answered that he had killed 8 people. The officer told him to call back when a senior detective was available. He called back. He sat in or near that phone booth and called again. And then again, he had to explain himself. He had to convince them that the call was real, that the man on the other end of the line was not a crank, not someone wasting their time. Edmund Kemper, who had spent years being taken at his word by the very department he was now calling, who had been trusted and listened to and welcomed at their bar, had to argue for the credibility of his own confession. There is something in that detail that stays with you. The system had missed him completely on the way in, and it nearly missed him again on the way out. He was eventually taken seriously. Officers in Colorado were contacted. He was located, and he surrendered without incident. He was cooperative when they arrived. He answered questions clearly. He did not resist or deny or qualify anything. He sat down with investigators and began, from the beginning, to explain everything he had done and why, in the same calm, organized, unhurried way he seemed to approach most things. The confession was just the start of it. What came next would change how law enforcement understood people like him for decades. When FBI agents Robert Ressler and John Douglas arrived at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville to interview Edmund Kemper, they were in the early stages of building something that did not yet have a formal name. The Bureau had begun sending agents into prisons to sit with convicted killers, not to relitigate their cases, but to understand them, to ask the kind of questions that had never been asked systematically before. What were you thinking? Why that person? Why that moment? What did it feel like before and after? Most of the men they interviewed were guarded or boastful, or simply not capable of the kind of reflection the research required. Kemper was different. He sat across from them and talked, not to perform, not to manipulate, at least not in the ways they had come to expect. He described his own psychology with a precision that the agents found, by their own accounts, unlike anything they had encountered in that setting. He could articulate the internal process, the planning, the way his thinking organized itself around an outcome, in terms that were almost clinical. He was, in effect, giving them a guided tour of a mind they had never had direct access to before. That material became foundational. The concept of the organized offender, someone who selects carefully, controls the environment, manages risk, and thinks several steps ahead, came into much sharper focus through those conversations. The behavioral science unit, which would go on to shape how law enforcement across the country approached violent crime investigation, was built in part on what men like Kemper were willing to explain about themselves. He was one of the most significant interview subjects in the project's early years, and investigators said so. In November of 1973, he was tried and convicted on 8 counts of first-degree murder. At sentencing, he requested the death penalty. He said he deserved it. California had suspended executions at the time, and so the court sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole. He has been denied parole at every hearing since. He remains incarcerated at the California Medical Facility. The question his case leaves open is not complicated to state, though it is hard to sit with. If the psychiatrists at Atascadero had been listened to, if the juvenile records had not been sealed, If the system had placed him anywhere other than back inside his mother's house, what changes? 6 young women might have gone where they were going and come home again. A town might not have spent years afraid. The answer, of course, is that we cannot know. But the question matters, because the failure was not invisible. The warning signs were documented. The concerns were written down by professionals and then set aside. The system did not miss Edmund Kemper because he was hidden. It missed him because the people in a position to act chose, at almost every available opportunity, to look away. That is the part of this story that does not fade. Edmund Kemper is still alive, still incarcerated, still, by most accounts, cooperative and articulate when researchers and journalists request access. The man who had to convince a police department to believe his own confession has spent decades being studied, interviewed, and cited in training materials used by law enforcement around the world. The warning signs were there from the beginning, written down, evaluated, and ignored.